cognition ladder. He's just
Right.
talking about appearances.
Right.
When we speak to these people in metaphors until they feel enough emotion to do what I'm asking them to do.
That's good.
And with that, we will tell you about our sponsor today, Tullamore Dew, the legendary Irish whiskey, triple distilled.
Yes,
don't
I
know
can
what that
say
means, but it sounds good.
it's excellent. 2 weeks ago, we had Auchentoshan's 3 Wood, which by its very nature is also triple distilled, I believe. It is.
Very nice.
Just confirming. And Tullamore rivals it, frankly. It's not Scotch.
Cheap. It's $12.
Wow.
See, that's the thing.
When you go to Irish whiskey, yeah.
When you go to Irish whiskey, you're getting amazing flavor for a layman's price.
I'm very much so enjoying it. I will say, compared to a Scotch, far less complicated.
Scotch is definitely just layers on layers of flavor.
Yeah. But I'm enjoying this perhaps even more because of my simple palate, we'll say.
Well, my palate is also simple. It's been rendered simple by so much alcohol consumption. So, the question I have that I prepared almost as a transitional point. How do you think logos and rhetoric interact? And there's many things to think about here. How can they interact poorly? How can they interact well? Is there even a touching point between logos and rhetoric? And inherent in this is that you and I maybe have not quite plumbed logos deep enough yet. We haven't agreed as to what we think about it, which is fine.
So last week, it was almost a survey level of logos. We talked a little bit more about the sciences, acquisition of knowledge, observation, those sorts of foundational epistemological concepts. And this week we're continuing that with our source texts are Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan, and from Plato we read Gorgias, or you might say Gorgias.
Gorgias.
Whichever you prefer. We're not academics, so
High church pronunciation.
I can honestly say I've heard it several ways now. So, Gorgias, I'll probably say that. So, in that work of Plato's, the concept of rhetoric is explored quite a bit. A little bit of sophistry is explored. Socrates, as the main character in Gorgias, well, along with Gorgias and his disciple and a couple other characters in the dialogue. Anyways, Socrates is really, I would characterize him as being more deconstructive in that work rather than constructive. So it's not like he's building up an idea, it's more like he's tearing down an idea, a notion that was common to Athenians, the notion of rhetoric. So Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, would you talk to that, Brendan?
Sure. In the Leviathan, a great example of this, for those of you who like pictures, there's a picture on the original Leviathan book where it shows the state. And the state is the height of man's art-making ability. It takes an artful ability to craft a state. That great Leviathan, as he calls it.
Yeah.
And at the very top of the state is the head. And that head is the ruler. And the idea is that for it to be a well-functioning state, there has to be this capstone.
Yeah.
And that was interesting to me, that there was one ruler at the top, and that ruler is the one who wields man's faculties well.
So, can we talk a little bit about this title, The Leviathan? I know the book itself can be daunting. I know when we first did the book club, it was like the longest book we've read, and it's kind of technical and all this.
Well, for those who are slightly less religious, you're going to have to dive in with us for a second, because this goes all the way back into 16th or 17th century Puritan symbolism and Puritan ideas of Christianity. And one of the images that is used in the Bible is this beast called Leviathan. It's mentioned in the book of Job. The King James Version of the Bible, the word Leviathan is actually used. And then at the very end of the Bible, you may or may not draw a parallel between that great quote-unquote Leviathan and the dragon or beast that comes out of the ocean and is defeated in a great battle.
In Revelation, right?
Yeah. You may or may not draw parallels, but what's interesting about Hobbes is that he decides that Leviathan is the state, and the state is a creation of mankind. So all the libertarians, all the libertarians and anarchists love Hobbes all of a sudden. But not quite. It's a bit more complicated than that, because you couple with that the fact that there's a ruler at the capstone who wields man's faculties well. One of those main ones being the Greek word logos that we've mentioned many times. And Hobbes accepts the simple definition of logos being speech and good reasoning.
Yeah.
And he uses all of that to do the main goal of all of this, which he says, I forget which chapter, but I was just looking at it, I have the book right here, keeping the people safe.
Oh.
But what's interesting about this is that Hobbes comes from a background based in this Puritan ideology. Even if he wasn't a Puritan, he was based around it. I think he might have been Church of England. But he has all this lingo to go off of, and Leviathan is not a positive epithet to refer to anything.
That's what I was kind of getting at, right? It's almost like he's calling the state a big, evil, scary beast, right?
Yeah.
Just inherent in the title. What's his historical context? I mean, what was the reception, maybe even from his own government, of this, or do you know?
Yeah, I don't recall exactly what the reception was, but I can tell you the reception today is very, very mixed.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people who hate it entirely, and there are a lot of people who love it.
Yeah.
And what's funny is that it's not a perfectly stratified group of those who hate it and love it. I've seen anarchists who love this book. I've seen Christians who love this book, atheists who love this book, neocon types who love government, classical liberals. You know, it appeals to a broad range of people. I personally enjoy it because I can speak to it being receptive to deep needs in the human condition.
Okay.
And that is that the state will look one of two ways.
Yeah.
It will either be very, very complicated and have no wise ruler, and therefore alienate a lot of people, or it will be very, very complicated but have a wise ruler and not alienate the wrong people.
Yeah.
And that's a simple layman's definition from somebody who's read the whole thing.
That's super, super good, because you just described, in the first definition, a whole bunch of countries that we can think of. And then in the second definition, a whole bunch of other countries that we can think of. So I think the relevance of that is extremely pertinent in this current day.
And that's what I was curious about, is how does the ruler spoken of in the Hobbesian point of view relate to the Platonic idea of rhetoric? And that's something I was thinking about today as I was working in the yard. I couldn't quite figure out how the rhetoric-logos combination would work, how they interacted. Rhetoric being defined as, for our audience, the ability to use and discover the means of persuasion in any given situation.
Sure, yeah.
The person who comes to power in Leviathan doesn't seem to be maneuvering like somebody from the movie Godfather, or like the stereotype of the politician in the back room talking to all of these people and cracking deals under the table and paying people off. He doesn't seem to be using rhetoric in that way. And that's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
How do you think the Platonic ideal of good speech, well-reasoned speech, interacts with this kind of top ruler?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. We could go pretty deep here. In my mind, when I hear rhetoric, I actually hear a term that's oriented towards persuasion more than it is towards rightly ordering speech, if that makes sense. So, rhetorically speaking, we should use logos as a means to the end of persuasion. That's how I'm envisioning this interaction between rhetoric and logos. So, in so much as we as humans in our minds recognize structure, i.e. logos, i.e. respond well to hearing the truth. In a later, well, I should say a recent book club, I talked about how humans just resonate when they hear the truth. They just are like, oh, that's true, and it's this kind of an aha moment, and there's a whole bunch of other terms for it. So what I'm envisioning here is that going on as a result of embedding logos in your rhetoric.
And that's interesting because Hobbes says some things that strike close to that. He talks about how words signify things. It's just a simple way. Words signify things. They symbolize things. You could say words are symbols.
It's very direct, yeah.
But the problem comes in whenever words cease to signify the things that they should signify. And that's the problem. You have a should there that people like Hobbes don't necessarily talk about. And this might be the basis of the difficulty about rhetoric, because Hobbes believes words should signify something, and there might be a signification that is unchanging. But the problem there is, who says that a word should signify a particular thing? I know for a fact that since high school, we've been having discussions. And whenever we would have discussions, we've been able to imbue words with new meaning or rediscover old meaning of a word that has fallen out of its previous usage.
I was going to say, it's just not how language works. Like, language is not arbitrary.
It's very fluid.
Yeah.
But I don't think that Hobbes sees it that way. So the question I would ask you is why?
Wow.
Why might he not see it that way? And that will probably relate directly to rhetoric.
Yeah.
In that we talked earlier about how rhetoric can be a smoke and mirrors show.
Yeah.
So that would be my next question is, should words signify one thing? Maybe you could elaborate on why you think that words don't necessarily need to signify one thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not really going to state my opinion on this yet, because in all honesty, I don't have one quite yet.
This is definitely an open topic. It's directly related to some of our active, ongoing discussions about truth and the nature of it. In fact, our next month's book club is focused on this concept of truth as itself, like what really is truth, what's the right definition.
No.
I know in philosophy, there's roughly 4 different definitions that are all exclusive of themselves. So you have to pick one.
Because a lot of people don't realize that. When you read the news.
Yeah, they're just like, oh, it's true. And it's like, well, what kind of true?
It's either true or it's fake news. It's like one of the two. There is no third or fourth option. So and the reason I bring this up, even though it might not be relevant to this week, is because it seems to relate to Plato's problem with Gorgias. Gorgias, whatever we choose to refer to him as. His usage of rhetoric. Rhetoric is a knack to be able to twist words. It seems that Plato says that.
Yeah, Plato's pretty much asserting that Gorgias's use of rhetoric, see, it's really an interesting book, because on its surface, it says, almost nothing. And then just a couple layers beyond that, it says a whole lot about the state of Athens, the state of philosophers in the day, the state of rhetoricians especially. So Plato, using Socrates as the main character, pretty much dismantles the notion of rhetoric as a means to a good end. He shows that it is almost just smoke and mirrors. It is, effectively a lower form of sophistry, which, if you're familiar with that term, basically just means deceit. Deceit using complex twistings of words. Although sophistry, I was going to bring this up, when thinking about reasoning, which is maybe the connection with logos and rhetoric, is this idea of reasoning, especially syllogistic reasoning. Sophistry is often comprised of syllogistic reasoning. However, its basis, its starting point, is weak. And so using syllogistic reasoning from a weak starting point can arrive at weak conclusions.
And that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because anybody today can call anybody a sophist. So then what's the starting point of sophistry in the classical mind?
Yeah. What I was going to say to your previous question, though, was I think Hobbes was asserting the absolute nature of words in order to avoid sophistry. I'm pretty sure that's his idea there.
Interesting.
And maybe he doesn't use that terminology, but how else are we going to avoid sophistry if words can mean whatever you want them to mean, right?
So that might be why a dictionary is such an old seasoned, powerful tool.
Yeah.
But sadly, when you look at a dictionary, 9 times out of 10, you get students coming out of AP classes in high school. Are they going to care about the dictionary, or are they going to care about the context the words were used in of the person they were studying in the class?
See, culturally, we don't recognize a dictionary as
Really don't.
an authority.
It's like a Bible. We don't
That's right.
recognize that.
We don't recognize it as an authority. We just don't. And maybe we shouldn't. Again, I would just say language doesn't work that way. As a broad statement, it's not natural for language to be arbitrary and precise.
So it's not natural, but it might be better.
It could be better. I'm not arguing that. And for
Yeah.
certain contexts, absolutely, it's better.
Yeah.
In scientific communities, absolutely. Like there needs to be one precise. That's why we have so much jargon in scientific communities. Is because the words weren't precise enough, so we make new ones that are more precise. Programming languages, same thing. It's like you have to mean one specific thing, or else it doesn't work.
Yeah, the models don't. It's like a mathematical model.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. So the question is, if we can't necessarily... Oh, let's go back to an earlier question.
Sure.
Starting point of... Instead of sophistry's starting point.
Okay.
Like if you had to equate what sophistry's starting point is and compare it to the right starting point.
Oh.
And this is a bit of a dichotomy, might even be a false dichotomy that I'm creating right now, but it might be helpful to plumb this a little deeper, because I do see a dichotomy between the Platonic / Hobbesian ideas and the Gorgiasian
Sure. Sure.
ideas. On one side, words signify what they signify. On the other side, words signify whatever you need them to signify to get the right people to do what you want them to do.
Exactly.
Right then.
It's not so much that words need to signify anything on the Gorgias side. It's more that words are tools. Words are of themselves not inherently useful, but put together in a specific context, in a specific way, can be used to persuade people, can be used as rhetoric. And of course, I think it was Gorgias' disciple in the text who was discussing how politicians specifically use rhetoric in order to gain power, in order to become great men. And this is one of the concepts that Socrates, as Plato's protagonist, if you will, really spends some time to deconstruct, and shows that this use of rhetoric is not... basically, that use of rhetoric isn't based in anything. It's not actually any better inherently than any other trade, than any other practice, than any other means of doing anything.
So if there was a starting point, the starting point would be seeking and finding power, maybe.
On the rhetoric side of things?
Yeah. And then from the Hobbesian and Platonic viewpoint, that's where things get complicated. And this is interesting. When you're digging in the right place, it seems to me that it gets more difficult to find.
It's more evasive.
It's more evasive.
Huh.
But when you're not digging in the right place, it's easy to define whatever it is you found. Now, it could be you criticize these texts and say, what if Gorgias had been the one writing the history books?
Sure.
He could have written Plato off as this idiot who spoke through his mouthpiece.
Yeah.
Always. Yes, I admit that. But that's not the way it worked out.
Another thing to consider that's definitely true. It's not the way it worked out. It didn't work out like that for a reason.
Yeah.
If we take any sort of... Well, I was going to say if we take any sort of meta-narrative to be true, although that's not even necessary. We could just say if we take into account the results, there is a better way because it won. Like, you don't even have to go into a whole meta-narrative. There's a singular meaning for history thing.
It could be a natural selection of narratives.
Exactly.
Natural selection could apply to all sorts of things. The ideas
Absolutely.
that gave men ability to master their environment or to give them comfort as they faced death.
One thing I was going to mention that's very related to this politician idea is the history, the context around Gorgias itself. This was during the time when the 30 tyrants were ruling over Athens.
So after the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, Athens and Sparta, at war, 30 tyrants. Actually, some of those tyrants are recorded to be, or supposedly were, relatives of Plato himself. And so almost like we have with Utopia, Thomas More, I believe, where the authorities that be weren't really all that keen on authors writing political texts, so he wrote, something that was kind of subversive. And there were many, many, many other examples throughout history of this being the case. Almost like that, Plato is writing this story, this dialogue, that would have been received as not so offensive to the powers that be. Some of them being his relatives, and basically Plato was writing against his current government without them necessarily realizing the depth of the argument that he was making against him. So
because he's talking about rhetoric, but then, and not necessarily the tyrants themselves. Here's an interesting point. At the head of the Platonic state in which he lived at that time, you didn't have one head, you had 30 heads.
That's true. A 30-headed Leviathan.
Now that is like a what's the word for that? There's a Greek monster.
What, the Hydra?
Yeah, the Hydra.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a Hydra. So then you look at the ideal Hobbesian state, and there's one tyrant at the top. And I call him a tyrant because when Hobbes speaks of his tyrant, he thinks that a state is a Leviathan. In the context, that word Leviathan would have been imbued with some negative connotations, but it's almost like he didn't even conceive of a state running efficiently with more than one ruler.
Yeah.
That's just a layman's interpretation of it, but I mean, when you think about our modern society, we don't have 30 tyrants, we don't have one tyrant, we have countless tyrants.
Yeah.
EPA, DEA, ATF, everybody's a tyrant.
We have levels of tyranny, yes. There's local, there's state, there's federal, yeah.
Now,
there's 3 branches of federals.
From these perspectives, we're not saying that we think this is tyranny. We're merely pointing out, from the historical context, this is not even an ideal state. This is something other than an ideal state. This is a Leviathan that is reproduced, possibly to the point of having all these hatchlings.
One thing I was thinking about this name, Leviathan, is Hobbes really just recognizing the nature of man as being evil? Is that what's going on here? Because it's not like he's saying the state is evil overall. Like, it's not like he's saying this has bad results, therefore we shouldn't have a state. It's more like he's saying this is a very complex machine that can't help to be evil because evil people are at the head of it, or evil people, construct it.
Leviathan in Job was just a beast. It wasn't...
Yeah, it wasn't inherently destructive.
Now, this is very interesting because this is like the libertarian interpretation. Not having a state isn't the problem.
Yeah.
Getting rid of the state isn't the issue. Almost the anti-anarchist point of view. But then somebody could respond to that and say, okay, well, if all of the parts are equally evil and depraved that make up this great Leviathan, who's to say that Leviathan will not be a simple beast?
Yeah. Like
the beast Leviathan was in Job.
Mm-hmm.
But will be an evil creature. Who's to say that will not happen? So what causes that to not happen? And perhaps Hobbes would say,
right?
The head's use of speech.
Yeah.
To influence the body.
So before we press that record button, you were mentioning how the head, that they functioned with rhetoric and logos, right? Yeah. So to answer this question, isn't that the answer? Isn't the answer just that they use logos rightly and their rhetoric is, isn't that what you're getting at with the answer?
Could be. It could be. Let's maybe think of it, instead of the head influencing the body with all of its parts and the people that make up those parts, what do we give more weight to? The body with all of its parts or the head? Because the body with all of its parts could outweigh the head. We've seen with all the revolutions that happen. I mean,
that happens sometimes.
The state can devolve into tragic, lack of order anytime you want, because the people, supposedly, who make up the Leviathan and aren't the head, decide who the head is.
Yeah.
Supposedly.
Well,
that adds some complexity.
It does add some complexity, right? It's like, how much power can the head really wield? Ultimately, power is contained in individual people. Yeah. It's just a means of controlling them that the one man becomes the head, right?
And I think we've seen that so well in our modern day. We have, and I'm not going to speak to the morality of using rhetoric, the truth of the rhetoric, or anything like that. I'm merely going to speak of effectiveness here. The effectiveness of Trumpian-era rhetoric
That's so true.
is just profound.
It is.
It is profoundly effective.
And it's not really even absurd to call it sophistry, which in Gorgias, Socrates asserted was a higher form of rhetoric, in fact.
Yeah.
So
it's a higher form of pulling things out of one's you-know-what. But hey, all politicians do it. That doesn't mean that Trump is any less worse or better than any politician that has come before. I mean, tons of politicians have used rhetoric. You have to, from a certain perspective. It's the tool of the trade.
I mean, it's more even historically rooted than that, right? Apparently, in Plato's day, that's what was going on. In 500 BC Athens, rhetoric was the means by which politicians gained power. In Hobbes's day, same thing. He in fact, it's so clear, it's so precise, and it's so pervasive that he can write this massive tome called the Leviathan to describe this process, effectively by which politicians gain power. Now, granted, the Leviathan is about a little bit more than that, but still, the idea is there. And in the modern day, we have no difficulty seeing that that's how things work.
Yeah, it's not a Leviathan now. There has to be a word for a bigger creature, but...
We the behemoth, right? I mean, I don't know. New book title, The Behemoth. We have to draw some sort of conclusion from this going on throughout the ages, right? And my proposed solution to this is to say something about the nature of man. And that's what I was getting at previously in the conversation with, what is Hobbes calling the nature of man evil? And I think our answer is not necessarily, right? Because by using Leviathan, while it is a great beast, an awesome beast, it's not necessarily it's not like the beast has evil intention, even if it has evil capability, right?
That's true. The beast is governed by its appetites, it's governed by its needs of that moment. Now, the problem is when you equate beast-like beastiness with what mankind and womankind do, then there's a lack of ability to equate that, and then mankind calls their needs in the moment, their natural appetites, evil, or at least they have historically. But that's probably a whole entire different podcast.
That's true. I am bringing in a lot of ideas that we've not yet covered.
This is exactly related.
The very nature of evil, though.
What I brought up wasn't related.
And good. I mean, we don't have
that yet.
We don't have the basis.
We're merely just talking about at this point, I guess. It's tough to determine who has more power.
Yeah.
We seem to be in a power world right now.
Yeah.
Who has more power? The individual people who make up the whole, or the head? And what you were saying is totally related. What I was inferring is that the stuff about the nature of evil is not related.
Yeah.
And that's the difficult thing.
Yeah. Well, one other thing, for our book club this month, I did a bit of a short story as our monologue / introduction between the two books. And the point of the story was, although maybe it wasn't quite this clear, the point of the story was actually that the knowledge of humanity is worth something. In this story, some individuals in a post-apocalyptic world, a tropish world, in fact, find some an archive of sorts of old books. And from those, although it doesn't quite explore this in the story, a revolution is spawned by which the world is renewed. And of course, the story ends long before that. But regardless, I wanted to see, back on that idea, all right, we have Hobbes, we have Plato, and a million authors in between, and many more since then even. What do you think, overall, how have we been contributing to the knowledge of mankind since the Platonic times?
Wow. That's a great question, because I think it really hits at the heart of this. Like we talked about last week, the Socratic and Platonic, some would even say, maybe wrongly, the Petersonian view is that the individual's responsibility for themselves is the basis of all of this. Then when you look at Leviathan, you seem to see this creation of a state that may or may not be based upon faulty or not faulty people.
Yeah.
And the creation of the state will happen either way. No matter what happens, the state will be created, and there will be a ruler or a bunch of rulers who come out of it. So you could call it the contrast between groupthink and individualism. And what's so funny is that people seem to say we're more individualistic today. But that isn't what I see in our political institutions.
It's
and
awkward,
our media,
right?
Our media wields us and wields our emotions and our opinions.
We're far more connected than we ever have been. Everyone says that. And yet, you're right, there's this almost contrary assertion that we're more individualistic in nature. And it's a bit of a confusing thing because the more connected we are, if you just think about us as nodes in a network, the more connections we have, the more interaction we have, the more similarities and dissimilarities form because of that. I can't see how that would cause us to be anything except less individualistic.
Yeah. More related to each other and in a weird way feeling less connected. More connected, but feeling at the bottom of our souls like we're missing something. Like something is missing. And folks, that has been our discussion for this week on the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast. If you'd like to hear more about our work, you can go on our YouTube or to positiveperspectives.net to read our delving into the old ideas and the great questions and the thinkers of the past. Thank you for joining us this week, and I hope that you will continue to consider how rhetoric affects your daily life and how the great Leviathan in which we all live and will always continue to live will hopefully relate to your everyday thinking. Thank you.
This has been Jacob Murdoch and Brandon Moore, signing off.